little ships. The refugees below were panicking. From his balcony atop the spaceport, Oz could see that the throng of life forms in the street below was becoming dangerous. Thousands of his people were being crushed up against each other by the sheer volume of people in the crowd. There were other species, too, creatures of every shape and size, and shouts for space pierced the air in a dozen languages. Those at the back, clinging to any shred of hope for salvation, shoved forwards blindly, fear and desperation rendering them oblivious to the crush ahead. Their struggle was all for nothing. No rescue awaited them inside the spaceport. The last ship off-planet was barely more than a twinkle in the sky. A beautiful Federation cruiser, capable of carrying 10,000 life forms. It had abandoned them, taking 200 beings. It was indistinguishable from the stars now, fleeing the doomed planet and leaving the refugees below to their gruesome fate. Death awaited the lucky ones. Slavery was the best the others could hope for. The balcony shook as a nearby explosion rattled the spaceport to its foundations. Oz clung to the railing and waited for the shaking to subside. The enemy were coming closer now, the crackle of laser fire in the distance growing louder by the second, almost drowned out by the screams of the crowd below. We brought this upon ourselves, he thought. It had been exhilarating for his people to discover that they were not alone in the galaxy. There was a whole community of species out there, a federation. They had made his species such grandiose promises, telling them they would make them rich, advanced, and powerful. And so, they had opened their borders to them, grasping hungrily at the technology, information, and power they had been offered. They had drawn too much attention to themselves. Eventually, the enemy noticed them too. The transponder in his pocket flashed and beeped, ignored. He watched on in horror as the closest enemy gunship, drifting lazily above the city, rained destruction on the buildings below. An explosion rocked the side of a distant skyscraper, toppling it like a tree and blasting chunks of debris into the street. The ship was heading directly towards him, carving a path of ruin in its wake. The worst part was that they had known this was coming. They could have been saved. He had sent dozens of distress signals to every government that had a representative on his planet. Every single one had abandoned them to their fate. Cowards, all of them. Too afraid of the invaders, too worried they would draw their ire to their own borders. You must surrender at once. Do not contact us again. You endanger our people. We're sorry. Only the humans, another relatively young species, had responded positively. We will do our best. But their systems were too distant to offer any aid. Their response had just felt like another nail in the coffin, to borrow one of their idioms. Empty words, meant to give hope to a condemned planet. As he continued to watch the crowds push and sway below, Oswald was surprised to find that he did not feel despair or sadness, only overwhelming anger. Anger that the Federation, with all its promises of wealth and power, had done nothing to help them. Anger that his people had been abandoned by the other governments at the first sign of danger. Anger that he had been left to die, whilst the wealthy and powerful fled on their yachts to live another day. The gunship was closer now. There was a collective groan of terror from the street below as some of the refugees spotted the approaching ship. Row upon row of weapons peeked out from its sleek hull like oars on an ancient boat, each one firing haphazardly into the defenseless buildings. In minutes, it would be here, and Oswald would be put out of his misery. The transponder was still beeping insistently inside his pocket. Fresh anger swelled within him. It was probably another refusal to help from some corrupt government. Expecting another dismissal, he reached into his pocket to switch it off. He glanced at the message disdainfully, and his eye widened in surprise. It was Earth. Rescue fleet incoming. Prepare for evacuation. Empty words, surely. It was too little, too late. The enemy had descended on the city like insects to a carcass. What little resistance they had been able to raise had been swept aside with brutal efficiency. The building shook again, and he watched numbly as his home was destroyed, backlit by burning buildings. The ship was almost directly above him now. He watched as the guns turned to face him. Oz closed his eye. He was bitter, angry, and resentful, but he had accepted his death. And yet, for some reason, nothing happened. He opened his eye to find the weapons swiveling to face upwards, the gunship rising quickly into the sky. "Where is it going?" he thought. He swept his gaze further up, and what he saw, approaching from the sky, took his breath away. Above, as though the stars themselves were descending, the light of 1,000 ships filled the sky. Earth itself was too far away to help, but it had not abandoned them. His heart leapt, and he heard the crowd below cry out in jubilation. Earth really had come to rescue them. There was hope. The fleet descended through a swarm of lasers, fired relentlessly upwards by the invaders in the city. Explosions marked where ships were annihilated by the storm of artillery, but only a few were firing back. They are being slaughtered. Why are so few of them fighting back? He thought, hope beginning to dissipate once again. As they came closer, he could make out the shape of individual ships, and his question was answered. Humanity had not sent a battle fleet. Not one frigate, cruiser, or battleship had come to rescue Oz's people. The distance from Earth had simply been too great. And yet still, it looked as though every human ship in the sector had answered the call. Little ships of every shape and size. Asteroid miners, transport shuttles, freight haulers, diplomatic barges, luxury yachts, even some pirate frigates. Humanity's little ships had flocked here, selflessly putting their lives at risk to save his people. There were simply too many for the enemy to cope with, and for everyone shot down, 3 more broke through the line to land in the city, sweeping up as many refugees as they could cram into their holds. The crowd cried out in jubilation as a clunky asteroid miner and an ancient-looking transport shuttle, pockmarked by laser fire, rattled into the spaceport. Down on the street, Oz joined the queue to board the ship. He was ushered aboard by a wizened old human, refugees cramming themselves into every inch of space. And finally, they rose into the night. Through the window, the devastation was horrifying. Explosions continued to rock the city, buildings collapsing and millions slaughtered. Oz's anger deserted him, and he was left with nothing but grief, thick and suffocating. He was grateful to be alive, but he knew he would never be able to return to the planet he called home. Earth, 1 year later. As the representative for the few of his species that survived, Oz stood alongside the human president at the dais. He had spoken for his species, although in reality, no words would ever capture the debt of gratitude they owed humanity. Of the 3,243 little ships that had answered the call, 1,350 had not returned to Earth. They had sacrificed their lives and their futures to help his people. Humanity had selflessly come to their aid, and worse, had made a ferocious enemy in doing so. He watched, vision filmy with tears, as the president addressed the planet. He was mid-speech, his bearing regal and confident. And I am confident that if given the choice, and knowing the outcome, every one of those brave souls would still fly fearlessly into that storm of fire to the aid of the innocent. And yet wars are not won by evacuations. I pledge here today, in sight of God, man, and our new allies, that we will fight the tyranny of the enemy with every ounce of our strength. Humanity does not forget its friends. He glanced at Oz with fierce eyes, and at his command, 1,000,000 warships rose into the night sky. This time, humanity was sending its big ships. Perhaps, Oz thought, I will see my home again.